In a fiery moment on Capitol Hill, Karoline Leavitt faced down a tough liberal journalist who had one question in mind: Trump's alleged abuse of power. What happened next left the reporters stunned and the room in disbelief. Make sure to like and subscribe for more political showdowns, and stay tuned as Karoline Leavitt shuts down this attack in spectacular fashion. It was a crisp morning on Capitol Hill, where a buzz of anticipation filled the air. The room was packed with reporters, cameras flashing, microphones poised, waiting for the moment when the political showdown would begin. Among the faces in the crowd, one name stood out: Karoline Leavitt. Known for her sharp wit and unwavering stance, she was no stranger to controversy, and today her opponent was a familiar one, a well-known liberal journalist who had been itching to ask her the hard questions. Karoline walked up to the podium, her confident stride cutting through the noise in the room. She didn't flinch as the spotlight hit her. She was used to it. She had prepared for this moment. She had anticipated every angle, every question. But there was one question that would ignite a firestorm, one question that had been asked countless times in the past, yet always seemed to catch her off guard. It was the question about Trump, about power, and about the supposed abuse that some claimed had stained his legacy. "Karoline," the journalist began, leaning forward, his voice filled with that all-too-familiar tone of skepticism. "You've aligned yourself with former President Trump, even after the accusations of power abuse during his administration. How do you respond to critics who claim that he overstepped his bounds and used the office for personal gain?" The question hung in the air like a sharp blade. The room fell silent, all eyes on Karoline as she straightened her posture, ready for the confrontation. Was this question truly about accountability, or was it an attempt to discredit her, an attempt to frame her as a supporter of something sinister? Was this just another attempt to paint anyone associated with Trump as part of a corrupt, dangerous machine? A smirk flickered at the corner of Karoline's lips. She could feel the energy shift in the room as the tension built. This wasn't going to be a simple exchange. It was going to be a battle of words, an intellectual sparring match where the stakes were high. She leaned into the microphone, her voice calm but resolute, ready to cut through the noise. "It's interesting," she began, "how quickly people are to judge, to throw around accusations without ever truly understanding the context. You ask about abuse of power. Let's talk about real power abuse, shall we? You see, power isn't just about wielding authority for personal gain. Power is about making decisions that shape the future, that benefit the people, even when others don't agree with those decisions." The journalist raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback by her immediate deflection of the question. But he wasn't ready to let her off the hook so easily. "So you're saying there was no abuse of power under Trump? No overreach? No unethical behavior?" Karoline's eyes flashed with intensity. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, waiting for her next words. This was her moment to turn the tide. "No," she replied firmly, her voice unwavering. "What we saw was a president who took bold action, who stood up to the system and to those who wanted to undermine his agenda. You call it abuse of power. I call it fighting for what's right, for what he believed in. But let's not pretend for 1 second that what's been labeled as abuse is any different than the tactics used by other politicians. The difference is Trump wasn't afraid to expose the corruption. He wasn't afraid to do what was necessary, even if it meant upsetting the status quo." The room was silent for a moment as Karoline's words hung in the air, challenging the narrative that had been built around Trump's presidency. The journalist who had expected to corner her was now on the defensive. He hadn't anticipated this level of clarity or conviction in her response. She could see the doubt in his eyes. She had done what he thought was impossible. She had reframed the entire question, turning the focus back on the real issue at hand. The truth behind the accusations, the context that had been deliberately overlooked. But Karoline wasn't done yet. She knew that the real fight was just beginning. As the journalist adjusted his glasses, preparing for another round of questioning, Karoline leaned back, the calm confidence in her demeanor only growing. It was clear now, this wasn't just about defending Trump. This was about showing the world that when it came to taking a stand, Karoline Leavitt was ready for anything. And the audience? They were hooked. The tension in the room was palpable. Karoline's words had landed with precision, but the liberal journalist wasn't about to back down. He adjusted his posture, trying to regain control of the narrative. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every shift in his expression. The audience, already on edge, could feel the heat of the moment building. "Okay, Karoline," he said, his voice tinged with sarcasm. "You're clearly trying to paint Trump as some sort of misunderstood hero. But let's talk about the real consequences of his actions. He incited division. He undermined trust in the institutions. And let's not forget about the chaos that followed. Don't you think that's a sign of power abuse? Doesn't that worry you?" Karoline didn't flinch. She could feel the trap closing in, the journalist pushing hard to paint her into a corner. But she wasn't about to let him frame the conversation on his terms. Instead, she took a step forward, her eyes locking with his. "You know what's truly divisive?" Karoline asked, her voice dripping with intensity. "It's not someone standing up for what they believe in, even when it's unpopular. What's divisive is a system that's been rigged for decades, a system that only benefits the elites, while the everyday American is left behind. Trump wasn't perfect, but at least he wasn't afraid to ruffle feathers and challenge the establishment." The room was silent for a moment. The journalist blinked, clearly surprised by her ability to turn his argument back on him, but he quickly recovered, determined to regain control. "You're avoiding the real question," he pressed, "about the consequences of his actions. We saw the fallout of his decisions in real time. The country was torn apart by his rhetoric, his handling of crises. The damage is undeniable. How do you justify that?" Karoline's gaze didn't waver. She could feel the pressure mounting, but it only fueled her resolve. "I don't justify everything Trump did," she said, her voice steady but firm. "But let's be honest here. Every president has their flaws, their mistakes. The difference is Trump's flaws were constantly magnified by a media agenda that wanted him to fail. You talk about damage, but what about the damage done by the constant undermining of his presidency? What about the divisions that were already there long before he took office?" The journalist was visibly taken aback. Karoline had flipped the script again, forcing him to confront a reality he wasn't ready to acknowledge. He opened his mouth to retort, but Karoline didn't give him the chance. She leaned in, speaking with the kind of authority that silenced any further rebuttal. "Let's not pretend that Trump was the cause of every problem in this country. He was a symptom of a much deeper issue, an issue that goes beyond him. It's the corrupt political system, the corporate elites who control the narrative, and the media that fuels the fire. Trump exposed that, whether people want to admit it or not." There was a murmur in the room now. The journalists, once eager to critique her, were suddenly listening more intently. Karoline had just shifted the focus of the conversation, challenging the very foundation of the narrative media had been pushing for years. The liberal journalist, now slightly rattled, tried once more to regain his footing. "You still haven't answered the question," he said, his voice a little less certain now. "Do you acknowledge the harm caused by Trump's words and actions?" "I acknowledge the harm caused by a system that never held anyone accountable. A system that allowed corruption to fester under the guise of civility," Karoline shot back. "But don't ask me to ignore the truth. If we're talking about harm, let's talk about the harm done by decades of political elites who never had to face the consequences of their actions." Karoline could see the shift in the room. Her words were landing one by one. The journalist, who had hoped to tear her down, was now on the defensive. It was clear now. This was no longer just about defending Trump. This was about defending the people who had been silenced by the establishment. and Karoline wasn't going to let anyone take that away from her. She turned to face the rest of the room, her voice rising in conviction. So, go ahead. Keep calling it power abuse. But when history looks back, it will be clear who really had the courage to speak truth to power. The journalist opened his mouth to respond, but the room had already started to buzz with a new energy. Karoline's words had taken on a life of their own, and no amount of pushback would stop her now. The room had shifted. What had begun as a carefully constructed attack on Karoline Leavitt had transformed into a situation where the journalist was on the defensive, struggling to regain his footing. The once confident tone in his voice now wavered as he faced the undeniable truth Karoline had just laid out for all to see. Her words were sharp, calculated, and delivered with precision. For every point he made, she countered with an argument that resonated deeper, cutting through the rhetoric and exposing the flaws in his narrative. "Karoline," the journalist said, his voice tinged with frustration, "you keep talking about the system, but let's not forget the impact of Trump's decisions on real people. His handling of the pandemic, the rhetoric that fueled violence, the constant lies, these things had consequences. You can't just sweep them under the rug." Karoline's eyes narrowed as she tilted her head slightly. She had been expecting this. The accusations about the pandemic, the violence and the lies were recycled arguments, often used by those who wanted to erase the complexities of the real situation. She had already prepared for this. "Let's talk about the pandemic," she began, her voice unwavering. "Trump wasn't perfect, but let's remember the context. The media was quick to attack him for every misstep. But what about the praise he received when Operation Warp Speed was launched, and vaccines were developed in record time? And when it comes to the violence, let's be honest here. Trump didn't incite it. There were radicals and agitators before him, and they only grew in number because of the lack of accountability from the political elites. Trump didn't cause this. He merely exposed it." The journalist opened his mouth to retort, but Karoline didn't give him the chance. She had studied his tactics, seen the way he tried to steer conversations, and now she was prepared to turn it all around. She leaned in, her voice growing more intense as she pressed on. "Now, as for the lies you claim he told, let's talk about the lies being told by the people who wanted him to fail. Let's talk about the false narratives pushed by those who were more interested in undermining his presidency than actually doing the work of the people. It's not about Trump's words. It's about the actions that followed them. And what you fail to acknowledge is the fact that those actions resulted in real change for the American people. Jobs, tax cuts, criminal justice reform, the list goes on. Trump's words may have been controversial, but his actions spoke louder than anything else." The journalist's face flushed, his expression tightening as he tried to keep his composure. But Karoline could see it. He was starting to crack. Her words were hitting their mark, and she wasn't about to let up. "You want to focus on Trump's flaws?" Karoline continued, her voice growing sharper. "Sure, I'll give you that. He wasn't perfect. But who is? You've got Biden, who's been in politics for decades, and what do we have to show for it? Rising inflation, a weakened global position, and an economy that's barely keeping its head above water. The difference is that Trump didn't just talk about change, he made it happen." The journalist, now visibly rattled, shifted his stance. He had hoped to catch her off guard, to expose her loyalty to Trump as some kind of weakness, but he was starting to realize that Karoline wasn't the one he needed to worry about. She was sharper than he had anticipated, and her arguments were grounded in facts, not rhetoric. "Karoline," he said, his voice low and steady, though tinged with a hint of desperation, "you're glossing over the deeper issues. Trump didn't just divide the country with his words. He emboldened people who took things too far. There was violence in the streets. There was chaos in Washington. You can't pretend that didn't happen." Karoline's eyes flashed with determination. She had seen this narrative play out before. those who ignored the context, who refused to acknowledge the systemic issues that had been in place long before Trump came along. And now, it was time to set the record straight once and for all. The year. Violence didn't start with Trump, she said, her voice filled with conviction. It started with years of political corruption, with people who refused to acknowledge the concerns of the American people. Trump didn't create the division, he exposed it. And those who continue to push this narrative are the ones who refuse to see the truth. The chaos in Washington wasn't his doing. It was the result of a broken system that didn't serve the people. Trump didn't just point out the flaws, he tried to fix them. The room had fallen silent. Every eye in the room was on Karoline. Now, and the journalist, despite his best efforts, found himself speechless. The arguments that he had relied on to discredit her, to discredit Trump, had all been dismantled. Karoline had turned the conversation from a defensive battle into an offensive one. She wasn't just defending Trump. She was defending the very people who had been overlooked, ignored, and silenced by the establishment for so long. The atmosphere in the room had shifted entirely. What started as a standard interview, full of confident, one-sided arguments, had now transformed into a battlefield. The liberal journalist, once eager to tear Karoline down, now found himself cornered by her sharp intellect and compelling rebuttals. The energy in the room was palpable, and even the audience could feel the momentum changing. Karoline Leavitt wasn't just a political figure. She was becoming a force to be reckoned with. The journalist, visibly frustrated and running out of his usual talking points, let out a deep sigh. His eyes narrowed as he looked directly at Karoline. He had to finish this somehow. There was no way he could let her walk away from this unscathed, not after everything she'd just exposed. With a quick breath, he leaned in, preparing to land his final blow. "All right, Karoline, let's cut to the chase," he said, his tone shifting to a more pointed, challenging one. "You keep deflecting. You keep making excuses. But the truth is, Trump's time in office left deep scars on this country. He incited violence, fractured communities, and undermined trust in the very institutions that this nation is built on. Can you honestly sit here and deny the harm that was done? The chaos he unleashed?" Karoline didn't blink. She was used to this kind of question. It was an easy attempt to cast her as an apologist for Trump, to paint her into a corner where she had no choice but to defend the indefensible. But Karoline wasn't one to fall for this trap. If anything, it was just another opportunity to turn the tables on him. "Let's talk about those scars," Karoline replied, her voice now calm but cutting. "What exactly are we talking about? Are we talking about the millions of people who felt unheard for years? The working-class Americans who were ignored by Washington for decades? Because, yes, they may have been angry, but it wasn't Trump who caused their frustration. It was the system that failed them." The journalist tried to cut her off, but Karoline raised her hand, silencing him. "I'm not done," she said firmly. "Trump's rhetoric may have stoked emotions, but let's not forget that the media, including your network, played a role in that. You constantly twisted his words, magnified his every flaw, and encouraged division at every turn. You can't pin the blame for a broken system on one man, and I'm not going to let you do that. Not anymore." The room had grown silent once more, the weight of Karoline's words sinking in. The journalist's face flushed, but there was no denying the truth of what she was saying. The media's role in perpetuating division was undeniable, and it was something Karoline wasn't afraid to call out. It was as though she had just stripped away the veneer of the narrative that had been pushed on the American public for so long. But the journalist wasn't done yet. He had one last attempt to take Karoline down. "Fine, Karoline," he said, trying to regain his composure. "You're right about one thing. The system is broken. But we both know that Trump's actions only made it worse. His constant attacks on the press, his disdain for institutions, he tore apart the fabric of American democracy. How do you justify that? How do you defend someone who undermined the very values this country was founded on? Karoline could see the desperation in his eyes now. He was grasping at straws, trying to make his case stick, but it wasn't working. Karoline took a deep breath, then responded with a final flourish, one that would leave the journalist with no room to maneuver. "You want to talk about undermining values?" she said, her voice unwavering. "Let's talk about the values that matter, the ones that are most important to everyday Americans. Values like freedom, economic opportunity, and the right to be heard. Trump didn't tear apart the fabric of democracy. He exposed how fragile it was. The very institutions that you claim he undermined were already failing the American people. Trump didn't break them. He revealed the cracks that were already there, the ones that had been ignored for far too long." She paused, letting the silence stretch out for a moment before delivering the final blow. "And the real question here, journalist, is this. If you're so concerned about the values this country was founded on, why don't you spend as much time exposing the corruption and incompetence that's been festering in Washington for decades? That's the real issue here, not Trump's words or his tweets." The journalist opened his mouth to respond, but the words never came. There was nothing left for him to say. Karoline had won. The room had shifted. The media's narrative was now being questioned, and the journalist, once confident in his attack, had been outmaneuvered. As Karoline stood tall, her eyes scanning the room, she could feel the weight of victory. It wasn't just about defending Trump. It was about defending the truth, about standing up against the system that had too long held the American people hostage. She had come in as the challenger, but she was leaving as the victor, and nothing would change. The final moments of the interview felt surreal. Karoline Leavitt stood tall, unwavering in her stance, while the journalist seemed to shrink, his frustration palpable. The room was still, the tension hanging in the air. It was clear to everyone present. Karoline had not only survived this interview, she had dominated it. The journalist, clearly flustered by her piercing responses, attempted to regroup. His words stumbled out, no longer confident or cutting, but desperate. "Karoline," he said, his voice quieter than before, "you can't just dismiss the concerns of millions of Americans. You can't keep saying the system is broken without offering any real solutions." His gaze was intense, as though he were hoping that some last-minute argument would salvage his position. But Karoline, composed as ever, wasn't going to let him off the hook. "Solutions," she repeated, her tone almost amused. "The solution is simple. We stop pretending that the system works for everyone, and we start fixing the real issues that have been ignored for far too long. We don't need to tear down what's left of it. We need to rebuild it so it serves the people, not the elites." Her words had the same clarity and precision that had carried her throughout the interview. She wasn't just pointing out the flaws in the journalist's argument anymore. She was offering the audience a blueprint for change, one that resonated with their own frustrations, hopes, and desires. As the cameras continued to roll, the journalist struggled to find his footing. His script, his rehearsed narrative, had crumbled. Karoline had taken him off script, and in doing so, she had exposed the shallow arguments that often passed as political discourse. The tension had reached its peak, but now, with her final words hanging in the air, it was time to end it. Karoline turned to the camera, her expression a mixture of determination and triumph. She didn't need to shout or make grand gestures. The power of her argument spoke for itself. "The truth is," Karoline said, her voice steady and resolute, "if you're willing to face the reality of what's been happening in this country, you'll see that the problems are deeper than we've been told. It's not about Trump. It's about the system, how it fails the people, how it lets the powerful control the narrative, and how we have to stop accepting it. This isn't just about politics. It's about our future." The room remained silent, the weight of her words settling in. The journalist had no more rebuttals left. He had been completely outclassed, his arguments shattered not by force, but by truth. Karoline turned and began to walk away from the table, her steps measured and confident. She knew she had made her point, and as she left, the camera lingered on the stunned journalist, still trying to find his words, while Karoline's presence filled the screen. In that moment, Karoline wasn't just a politician. She was a symbol of what it meant to fight back against a system that had long silenced voices like hers. She had outsmarted the journalist, but more than that, she had outsmarted the narrative that had been fed to the American people for so long. As the lights in the studio dimmed, one thing was certain. Karoline Leavitt had made her mark, and nothing would be the same from that moment on.